Thank you, Russ, very much indeed. To be called a good communicator by a man who makes rap videos and writes novels is praise indeed. No, seriously, looking around the room, I can see a lot of people whose ideas I've borrowed and pinched over the years when writing this book. Not only Russ, but Kevin McCabe and Don Boudreau and people like that. And so, yes, I'm afraid there's a huge amount of plagiarism goes into books like this. But then kind of that's my point. One of the things I'm arguing in this book is that ideas are cumulative and they come together and they meet and they mate and they transform each other. And that's sort of the process we're up to. So I hope you'll forgive me, those of you who see things coming up that you know about already. And what I've tried to do in this book, and what I'm going to, the book is very much about trying to persuade people that the world has been getting better and can continue to get better. But there's a sort of thematic reason why that should be the case, which is what I'm going to concentrate on talking about today, which is really sort of why human beings are the only species that experiences this sort of phenomenon, why they experience prosperity at all, why it's completely meaningless to ask a rabbit whether it's prosperous. Why is that? So in a sense what I want to do is explain how we went from making things like this to making things like this. And the Australian hand axe was made to the same design for 500,000 years, between about 1.5 million years ago and 500,000 years ago, with very little change in style or design. The mouse that sits on my desk next to it is obsolete in 5 years. That's the sort of extraordinary transformation that's happened to our species. And here's the very brief summary of what the talk's going to be about, so you can see where I'm getting to. First of all, I'm going to try and give you some examples of how the world is getting better, and surprisingly it's making people nicer, not nastier. It's because everybody is increasingly working for everybody else, which is a habit, I'll argue, that started 120,000 years ago or so, not, let's say roughly, I don't want to get pinned down too much. And that exchange is playing the same role in society that sex is playing in biology, and I'll explain what that means. The effect is to produce something called collective intelligence, a collective brain where knowledge is distributed through society rather than held in individual brains. We ain't seen nothing yet, and the global pessimists are mostly wrong. Important to emphasize what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that everything's fine. Quite the reverse. There's a huge amount of suffering and dreadful things in the world. I'm actually trying to raise our sights to realize how much better things could be. Things are not as good as they can be. It's not true that nothing's getting worse. There's all sorts of things that are still getting worse. There's no question about that. I'm just saying the big things on the whole have been and are getting better. And nor am I particularly bullish about any specific country. In fact, as a citizen of the Western world, I share what I suspect is a widespread view that we're in for a rocky few decades, those of us who borrowed too much in the 2000s, and that we may be facing really quite a long time in the doldrums. But China and India and other places which didn't borrow too much are going to keep the torch of innovation and prosperity alive. And I'm certainly not telling you that this is a sort of feel-good thing, that your approach to the world should be to be optimistic about everything. This isn't love your cancer or anything like that. In fact, there's some evidence that people are a little too optimistic about their own individual lives. They tend to stay married less long than they expect to, for example. So it's about the human race that I think there's too much pessimism, not about individual lives. Lord Macaulay said in 1830, on what principle is it that when we see nothing but improvement behind us, we're to expect nothing but deterioration before us? And I think that's a quote one should always have in mind whenever you read someone saying we stand at a turning point in history and everything's about to get worse. They've been saying that for 200 years. So first of all, are some things getting better? Well, this is life expectancy. It's going up at the rate of about 5 hours a day. This is globally. This is not just in the West. In fact, it's going up faster in the developing world than it is in the developed world. It's gone up roughly 30% in my lifetime. World product, the value of goods and services that we produce, corrected for inflation, has really, who knows whether this graph's entirely accurate, but it must have done something like that, and that's Angus Madison's estimation. Poverty. This is the latest data from Pinkowski and Salah E. Martin's paper about world poverty, showing how it's been declining. Now, there are different ways of measuring poverty. They have a different way than other people, but they're all going down. Pollution. Most people are not aware that air pollution in this country has halved in terms of the levels of these particular chemicals in the last 25, 30 years. Even oil spills. Obviously, this graph could turn around this year if they don't get this thing capped, but it would take a couple of years before the current spill would feature as one of the big green bars on this. It's not yet, it would have to leak for nearly 2 years to equal the Ixtoc-1 spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 1979. This is not to say that oil spills are a good thing. I'm certainly not saying that, but it is striking how, particularly from tankers, this is the data from tankers rather than rigs, but the tankers on the whole have spilled more than rigs over the years, how, we forget that actually this problem used to be considerably worse 20, 30 years ago. Water-related diseases in the United States, nobody dies of them now. Tuberculosis, mortality, measles and scurvy. Other causes of death, obviously not declining as fast as infectious diseases, but accidents are down, heart disease is down, cancer is not up. Most people assume, and most people predict, if you go back to the 1970s, a lot of environmentalists were predicting a massive epidemic of cancer caused by chemicals in the environment. It never happened. The AIDS epidemic came, but to some extent it has got better in the last couple of years. So just a summary of how much better life is in my lifetime. I was actually born in 1958, but let's take it from 1955. Life expectancy up a third, per capita income up threefold, food per capita up a third, child mortality down 2/3. That surely is the best measure of misery you can think of, and that's an extraordinary achievement on the part of the human race. And the population growth rate has halved in my lifetime. But of course, even these don't measure how much better life has got because of technology, and this is borrowed from William Nordhaus's estimate of the improved value of light in terms of how long you have to work how long you have to work to earn artificial light. If you're on the average wage and you want to read a book for an hour by an 18-watt compact fluorescent bulb, how long does it take you to earn that light? And the answer is about half a second of work. If you were doing so in 1950, it would have been about 8 seconds. Back in 1880, it would have been 15 minutes of work to earn that much light. And back in 1800, it would have been 6 hours of work on the average wage to earn 1,200 lumen hours. All that tells you is that the average worker couldn't afford a candle in 1800. Actually, that's true. We know that. And he certainly couldn't afford to sit down and read Jane Austen novels by artificial light, unless he had a very bright fire indeed. But it's a measure of the incredible improvement that in order to have all this blaze of photons falling on us, you don't have to work very long. And that means you've got more time to earn other things. And that's the definition, sort of prosperity. Well, I'm going to make the outrageous claim that we're actually getting nicer as the world is getting more commercial and better. Just a few examples. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but the homicide rate. This is data from Peter Sperenberg. Who knows if it's accurate, but homicide is one of those crimes that you can get a fairly accurate historical picture of, because on the whole it tends to be recorded, whereas other ones don't. Your chances of being murdered in Europe were an awful lot higher in the old days than they are now. This is an ancestral relation of mine called Bishop Ridley, who was burnt at the stake slowly from the feet upwards on purpose for the crime of believing that the body of Christ was only figuratively present in the sacrament at communion, not literally present, which you'll admit is a terrible crime. And, it was spectator sport in those days, 1555. Things like this remind us just how much less tolerant we are of cruelty today in all sorts of forms. And even inequality is falling worldwide. You may think inequality is rising in countries like the United States and Britain, and to some extent it is if you measure it in income inequality, although less so if you measure in consumption inequality because of welfare. But because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer, global inequality has actually been falling. And the reason is surely that everybody is working for everybody else. That's the name of the modern economy. That's what it's all about. Go back to the image of the Australian hand axe and the computer mouse. The Australian hand axe was made by one person for his own use. We know this because you can actually find places where they were made, and you can see that where the chips fell off the boulder that was being chipped, and you can see the shadow of the legs of the people who sat there making them. So people were self-sufficient in Australian hand axes. They made their own, probably. I mean, we can't be absolutely sure about that, but that's the way it looks. Whereas that computer mouse was made for me, and me alone, by thousands, millions of people. Obviously, I'm here starting to talk about the kind of things that Leonard Read wrote about in his famous essay, I, Pencil, which again featured in one of Russ's novels, that all these people were, none of these people knew how to make a pencil, literally, or knew how to make a computer mouse. The knowledge of how to make a computer mouse is stored all across society. And yet they were all working for me. Isn't that nice for me? Here's a rich chap, Louis XIV, the King of France, in the 17th century. And the reason he's rich is because he's got a lot of people to do things for him. They can make things for him and they can do services for him. That's essentially what makes him well off. So somebody made that silly outfit for him to wear. He had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. Here's a modern undergraduate tourist in the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV's palace in France. And she's not rich. She's an ordinary person. And, you know, by no standard could you call her as wealthy as Louis XIV. But think about it. Somebody made those jeans for her. Somebody made that electric light and the candelabras behind them for her to use in that palace then. She's got 498 people preparing her dinner tonight. They're all in bistros and Italian restaurants all over Paris. They're waiting for her to show up at an hour's notice, and they'll provide her with just as good a service. In fact, probably better than Louis XIV's got. There'll be more exotic ingredients and less chance of salmonella. When did working for each other start? Well, we can't know, but the suspicion is that the most original version of working for each other in the human race is the sexual division of labour. This is where, in hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, such as the Hadza in Tanzania, virtually all hunter-gatherer societies, it is true that men and women forage differently. On the whole, men hunt and women gather, but it doesn't always map quite that neatly. And this is a brilliant invention, because it means that men can go out hunting for meat, which is a risky activity that often fails, and know that there'll still be some food to eat when they come back at night. Women can dig for roots and know that they can still get protein to eat. All they have to do is dig a few extra roots and trade it for a bit of meat when the men come home from hunting. So both sides are better off for this transaction. It's a terribly important economic invention. No other species does it in quite this way. There are a few cases where you get species with different feeding habits, but this trade, this gains from trade feature of the sexual division of labour is pretty unique to our species. Now, until recently, archaeologists tended to think that this was very ancient and went back a couple of million years. But Mary Steiner and Steve Kuhn in Arizona have recently argued that Neanderthals may well not have had this division of labour. They were very cooperative, but they were all hunters, no gatherers, if you see what I mean. And that actually it might therefore be a comparatively recent human invention in Africa sometime in the 400,000 years since Neanderthals separated from our species. No evidence for that yet, but it's an intriguing thought that it might have been something that predisposed us to get into the habit of working for each other, if you like. And farming, when that was invented, is, if you think about it, species working for each other. It's a division of labour between species in which everybody benefits. Here are three species working for each other, the dog, the sheep and the man, and that's essentially what they're doing. And I think that's the simplest way of thinking about farming, is that it is different species working for each other. There are divisions of labour in other animals, of course. Here's a worker ant feeding a queen ant, and corals and other colonial animals, etc., have this division of labour. But it's very different in one respect. First of all, it's always within the family. An ant colony is just a big family. That's all it is, as they're all siblings within the ant colony. And secondly, for the same reason, the one division of labour that is the strongest in other animals is the reproductive division of labour. That is to say, reproduction is delegated to one individual or a few individuals. And that's true even in a wolf pack, for example. And that's not the case in human beings. Not even in England do we leave reproduction to the Queen. In fact, it's the remarkable thing about the human division of labour, the human working for each other, is that we manage to generalise it to complete strangers. And that is what has enabled us to achieve so much technologically and economically, I suspect. And I don't need to teach anyone in this room the law of comparative advantage by David Ricardo, but it is quite fun to rephrase it in Stone Age terms to take it back to an early time. Adam is not very good at making either axes or spears. Oz is better at making both axes and spears, but he's slightly better at making spears than axes, whereas Adam is the other way around. So Oz doesn't need Adam, does he? Because he's better at both. Well, no, of course he needs him, because if Oz makes 2 spears and Adam makes 2 axes and they swap, then they've each saved an hour of work. And that, of course, will be even more true the more it happens, because the more you specialize, the more it'll be true that each of them is better at one thing rather than the other. And that seems to me the big story of why, once you start exchanging and specializing, you go on doing more and more and more of it. Now, I'm going to argue that that started happening around 120,000 years ago. I've already suggested that the sexual division of labour may be older than that, but the business whereby you could actually exchange the products of specialised work between relative strangers is one that is probably more like 120,000 years ago. What's the evidence for this? Well, my first point is simply that the other kinds of things that we talk about as explaining the human special takeoff simply don't work in terms of timing. I mean, we rightly celebrate our big brains, our imagination, our language, our tool making, all these kind of things, but actually they arrive in the story much too early to explain why we went from just being an ordinary predatory mammal on the African savanna to suddenly building skyscrapers and making toothpaste and things like that. 2 legs, after all, one of the things we're very proud of, standing on 2 legs. Well, that happened much too early to be part of the story. Tools come in around 2.5 million years ago, and we made stone tools to beautiful designs for 2 million years without showing any signs of progress, without changing their designs faster than our genes changed, for example, which is an extraordinary and unimaginable thing. We don't think of technologies as not changing, but they did for very long periods of time. Fire, which unleashed calories from our food so that we were able to grow bigger brains and have smaller guts. Very important. Don't know when it happened, between 500,000 and 1.5 million years ago, but still much too early to explain that. And language, we used to think that could be quite recent in the last 100,000 years or so, but the evidence is now pretty strong that Neanderthals had the FOXP2 mutations and other related mutations that are certainly selected for by language, and therefore it looks like language was pretty well established before the split between Neanderthals and modern humans around 400,000 years ago. I'm going to argue that it's exchange that started, is the one thing you can identify that starts right towards the end of the story and that explains the transformation into modern people. Because the Neanderthals are an enigma. They had big brains. On average, they had slightly bigger brains than us. They were using tools, they were cooking, they were burying their dead, and as I say, they probably had language. And yet they show absolutely no progress. And by that I mean you don't see their toolkit changing. It changes little bits, but nothing like the sort of accelerating exponential change that we're used to in human beings. And you don't see their population increasing, and you don't see their niche changing. You don't see them changing their way of life during right up until the end, the 30,000 year mark, when we kind of wiped them out, except for the very few with whom we interbred a little, as we now know from genetic data from the last few weeks. And the argument, my argument is that they did not exchange. They did not trade between groups, and they may not have even traded within groups. How do we know this? Because Neanderthal tools are found in close proximity to the site of manufacture. You do not find them moving long distances. And that's not true of modern humans, even living in Stone Age conditions. So, for example, these are stone axes found in Australia that come from a quarry called Mount Isa in central North Australia. And you can... sorry, does that make a... Yes, there's the quarry. And the Kalkadoon tribe had these trading networks with their neighbours, and they would swap stone axes for things like stingray barbs, and you can see exchange rates that they had in terms of how many stingray barbs you needed to acquire a stone axe. But the point is that the result was that the stone axes from Mount Isa ended up all over Australia because of trade, not because of migration. So the answer is, when do we see human tools start moving long distances implicitly because of trade? And the answer is around 120,000 years ago. Now, this is the earliest evidence of trade that I've been able to come across. These are shell beads recently found in Algeria, which being probably worn on a string, and they date from at least 80,000, but the latest estimate is up to about 120,000 years old. And they're moving long distances. Because they're marine, we know they were collected on the coast. They're up to 125 miles inland so far that they've been found. So it's very unlikely that this was simply people migrating with a pocket full of shells. It's much more likely that these were going hand to hand like the stone axes in Australia. There's obsidian stone axes in volcanic glass axes in Ethiopia start moving around the same time, but it's harder to date. Nobody's quite sure yet, but it looks like it's about the same time that you start to see long distance trade in them as well. So I'm very interested in the period about 120,000 years ago, which is, by the way, the last interglacial. We're in an interglacial now. The last one was between 135 and 130 and 115,000 years ago. And of course, in interglacials, Africa tends to be a lot damper than it is during ice ages. It's extremely dry continent during ice ages. And the implication there is that human population densities would have been a lot higher in that interglacial than before and after. And here's a lovely counterexample of what happens. This is based on the work of Joe Henrich. When you don't have access to... sorry, falling over there. When you don't have access to trade networks. Tasmania was a peninsula attached to Australia until about 10,000 years ago, when it became an island. And it was populated about 35,000 years ago by people, and they lived lives very similar to other Australian Aborigines while it was connected with the mainland. But when it was cut off by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age, the 4,000 or so Tasmanians who survived there for the next 10,000 years saw a progressive diminution of their technological toolkit. They regressed technologically. They gave up bone tools altogether after a certain point. They gave up fishing equipment. They gave up clothing. They gave up boats and things like that. And the suggestion that Joe Henrich has made to explain this is that there was nothing wrong with their brains. It wasn't that they were getting stupider. It was that they needed a network of specialists and exchangers in order to sustain the knowledge of a sophisticated technological toolkit. Because, of course, what you're finding is only the tip of the ice age. There would be lots of things that would be needed. And if the 30 or 40 of us in this room were marooned on an island, it's a pretty good bet that most of the equipment we've got with us as we sit here today, we would not be able to continue making for 10,000 years, well, for 5 years, let alone 10,000 years. So the suggestion is that the Tasmanian collective brain was in trouble, not its individual brains. And as a counterexample, Tierra del Fuego, a similar island, similarly remote and cold and inhospitable, also inhabited it from about the same period, well, from during the 10,000 years, and no such technological regress. Why? Because the Straits of Magellan are very narrow and there was trade across them throughout prehistory, whereas the Bass Straits are quite wide. So my argument is that exchange has an extraordinary effect on the rate of cultural evolution, as if it, in much the same way that sex does on biological evolution. Most technologies are combinations of other technologies, and they come about through the cross-fertilization of ideas. And as someone once said, the motor car looks like it was sired by the bicycle out of the horse carriage. So I'm arguing that technology comes about as a result of sexual reproduction between other technologies, as it were. And here's the effect that sex has on biological evolution. If you imagine two different mutations that happen within the species, if it's an asexual species, the green mutation and the red mutation happen in different individuals, and those different individuals are then going to be in competition with each other. And if the green mutation is better than the red mutation, then it survives and the red mutation doesn't. But what if the red mutation is good, even though it's not quite as good as the green one? Let's say one gives you the ability to produce milk and the other gives you the ability to grow a placenta if you're a mammal. You'd really like to have them both together. Sex enables you to do that. It enables an individual to draw on genetic inventions that were made anywhere in your species. It enables genetic inventions to join the same team. And it's the same in respect of technology. Once you're exchanging, you can start to make technology cumulative. Let's say there are two tribes, one invents one thing, another invents another. They're in competition with each other, and the worst of the two tools goes extinct because the first tribe wipes out the second tribe. But if instead of going to war, they go to trade, then both tribes can end up with both tools. And that's what I mean by ideas having sex. And so the human habit of truck, barter and exchange, as Adam Smith put it, is, as he of course argued, I'm not really saying anything he didn't say 200 years ago, absolutely central to the story of humanity's explosion and expansion. Because, as I say, it leads to a collective brain. Back to this point about how nobody knows how to make a computer mouse. The knowledge is not stored in individual brains, it's stored all across society. And that means that once we started doing this, we were no longer limited by the size of our brains. And incidentally, this is why I'm not interested in measuring IQs of different races, because I think it's irrelevant. I think 100 stupid people communicating extremely well with each other, models show, would be infinitely superior to 100 clever people not talking to each other in terms of what they could invent and what they could hold, which I think is an important point. Here's Hayek's point, of course, making the same argument. Knowledge never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess. And so the collective brain is just another way of describing spontaneous order or emergent order. And of course it's a reason why central planning doesn't work. Now, just to end with some bold predictions that things could get better still for humanity. Ideas are having sex on the internet in the most promiscuous way imaginable. And things are coming together and recombining, and people are able to draw on different thoughts from all over the world in a much more rapid way. That must be having an effect on the rate of innovation and the rate of finding new ways of giving people goods and services cheaper or freer or more easily than they had before. That process cannot be slowing down. It must be speeding up, although I can't quite think how to measure it. And so we should start to raise our sights about the future. Instead of saying, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to destroy so much rainforest to grow food, let's start to say, I reckon we could feed the planet easily in this century and create more rainforest by returning farmland back to nature. Here's the roughly the acreage devoted to cereal growing in the world. It hasn't changed in 50 years, but the yield has nearly trebled. That's because of fertilizers and pesticides and new varieties of corn and so on. And the result of that, of course, is that we actually need less and less land to feed each person. Back in the days of hunter-gatherers, each of us needed 1,000 hectares roughly to feed us. Slash and burn agricultures need about 10 hectares per head. By the 1950s, we needed 4,000 square meters per head. Today, on average, if we're eating cereals, you can feed a person off 1,200 square meters or so. So the human footprint, in that sense, is capable of shrinking. And if the human numbers are going to start shrinking, which they are a little after 2060 by the look of it, then the amount of land we need to support humanity, not just in food, but in energy, etc., can start to go down, not be held from going up, if you see what I mean. Currently, we crop about 15 million square kilometers. If we were trying to feed 9 billion people as opposed to 6.8 billion, but we'd gone back to being local and organic, then we'd need a huge amount more land. Even if we went back to the sort of yields that pertained in the 1950s, we'd need a lot more land to feed 9 billion people. And even with today's yields, if they're the same as today, because 9 billion is more than the 6.8 billion we've got, we will have to take an area the size of Mongolia into cultivation if we want to feed 9 billion to the level that we feed 6.8 billion today. But actually, if yields continue to rise as they have been rising, if they double, say, then we will feed 9 billion from a smaller area than we currently feed 6.8 billion from. And I think that's a remarkable thought. I'm trying, as it were, to raise ecologists' ambitions to say, actually, we don't have to stop things getting worse, we can make them get better. Maximum practical yield, we could feed the world from a really small area. We may achieve that with hydroponics and all sorts of things, but I suspect we'll still want to have nice family-friendly local farms and things as well. Because, of course, the population growth rate is declining. It's halved in my lifetime, as I mentioned. And the actual number added to the human race started going down about 1987, and it's going down all the time. The projections of how rapidly it would fall keep being broken, keep being exceeded, and it may start to go up again. You know, no one can be sure, but it doesn't. It looks like we're headed for a stabilization of the population sometime between 2060 and 2070 at around 9.2 billion people. And just a few examples of why I think there is too much pessimism about the human race and the planet. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Perhaps we can talk about it more in questions. But the first thing is just to mention the inbuilt bias towards giving us the bad news and not giving us the good news, which is exemplified by this chart that appeared in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, showing the decline in maternal deaths worldwide, a number of people dying in pregnancy or childbirth. This was published in The Lancet, the medical journal. The editor of The Lancet came under huge pressure not to publish this paper because there were a number of pressure groups who were arguing for increased funds to work on maternal mortality. And they thought this graph would prevent them getting their message across. Actually, I don't think it would. I think you argue that things are going well, so give us more money if you want. But that's the shared interest between pressure groups and governments and media that good news is no news. Another example, this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which printed these numbers, which came from a peer-reviewed paper by a man named Arnell about estimating how many people would be at increased risk of water stress as a result of the various different climate scenarios that the IPCC envisages. You can see that nearly 1 billion people would be at increased water stress as a result of all of these scenarios. They are different rates of economic growth. And that was published in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But the rest of the table from the original paper was not published in the IPCC report. And it showed the number of people at decreased water stress. And in every case, it's a bigger number. So you would walk away from the IPCC thinking that 1 billion people are going to be at greater water stress, rather than that 1 billion people are going to be worse off and 2 billion people are going to be better off, which is the actual picture that most of these numbers are predicting. Talking of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, these are their 4 scenarios, the ones I mentioned there, for what will happen to human GDP per capita in the 21st century. And I sometimes look at this graph and think, well, then what's the problem? Because these are the scenarios that that in order to get high outputs of carbon dioxide, you've got to assume increases in GDP per capita. But high levels of carbon dioxide are said to be going to depress GDP per capita. Well, so either, in which case you're not going to get that, etc. You see what I mean? Anyway, if the last 50 years are a guide, then we will end up with roughly 9 times the GDP per capita on the entire planet by 2100. And, that may have implications for the climate. We can get into that argument if you like. But it is worth knowing the economic assumptions behind these models, I always feel. A lot of people say to me, well, it's all right being optimistic about Europe and Asia and North America, but what about Africa? Surely Africa hasn't got a hope. Far too many people, far too many wars, far too many diseases, all that kind of thing. No infrastructure, you've heard the litany. Well, I'm sorry, but I think Africa is hitting a demographic sweet spot quite soon. Its birth rates are falling quite fast. It's exactly the sort of position India was in 20, 30 years ago. There is all sorts of signs of commerce doing quite well in parts of Africa. Technologies like the mobile phone for individual farmers are catching on. And look, poverty is starting to fall pretty rapidly in Africa. May not last, but, and there's an awful lot of work to do. But I refuse to write off the continent of Africa as a lot of pessimists would have you do. However, it's no good. I'm a fool for saying any of this because it is not the man who hopes when others despair, but the man who despairs when others hope, who is regarded by a large class of persons as a sage. Thank you very much.
We're going to take questions.
Happy to take questions. Yeah.
There are also books available for sale and signing at the end of the questions.
Don.
That was great, Matt. But I'm going to challenge you on one point. And I know you got challenged in this yesterday at Cato as well. You seem to list the declining population as a benefit. And I want to challenge you to think that might actually be a cost, or alternatively, a rising population would be a benefit. Nothing to do with younger generations paying off entitlements that governments have committed to. I'm making a Julian Simon point that the greater the number of human minds you have in free societies, the greater the amount of sex between ideas that you get. I understand the point you made yesterday at Cato that even with 6.8 billion or 9 billion people, there's still a lot of untapped potential. But I would think that with 12 billion people, you'd have even more potential. And so a lot of the ideas that have created this remarkable prosperity that you so well document here, I think might even, the economic growth would be even higher if population growth were higher. I don't regard declining population as necessarily a good thing, except in places in which the society is so constrained that people are not free.
Yeah, I take your point, and I think you're probably right. I think if population were to go on growing rapidly, then economic growth probably would go on growing rapidly. But at some point we would start to hit Malthusian problems, I think. Even if you look at the productivity of land, eventually there are photosynthetic limits to how much food you can grow per acre. And if population had continued to be exponential as it was in the 50s, say, and by now we were at 10 billion and we were heading for 15, we would have ploughed a lot of extra land. We probably wouldn't have any tigers left by now, etc. I think we are going to have to accept, you're right, a slightly lower rate of innovation than we would otherwise have done. But I still think it'll be higher at 9.2 billion and stable than it is at 6.8 billion and rising.
I agree with
that. I completely buy the Julian Simon argument, and not, by the way, because somebody made this point to me earlier this week in New York that and I don't think this is what Julian Simon was saying, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the more people you have, the more chance of there being a genius. I don't think that's what counts. The more I look at innovation and simultaneous discovery in the patent system, etc., the more I conclude that it's, you know, perspiration, not inspiration, that we need, as it were. But I take your point. I think, you know, there is an argument there, and there's also the thing about aging populations. I don't think older people, I'm not talking about them being a burden. I'm talking about they're not that interested in innovation compared with younger people. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Yeah, sorry, in the aisle there, why not?
All right, so my question pertains to the notion that there might be some optimal level of alarmism that leads to the best policy results. And you could say, well, people should have true beliefs, and that's great, but, and this book would presumably shift them towards being less alarmist. But do you think that that's actually, like, a lot of these, you know, you brought that case up about maternal death, and it's really, people need to be alarmed even if they have false beliefs. Like, is that a concern? Are we at a place where having less alarmism will actually lead to better policy? You'd like to say, well, people with more true beliefs would lead to better policy, but you can understand this notion if there's a level of alarm. Do you think we're past the optimum point? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way of putting it. And of course I agree that, you know, that there probably is an ideal level of alarmism. But let me just discuss genetically modified crops for a second on this front, because it seems to me that the world is much too alarmed about the risks of genetically modified crops and much too unalarmed about the amount of poverty and malnutrition that exists already in the third world, which they could do something about. And you saw this when, for example, in 2002, Zambia refused food aid shipments on the grounds that they had been pressed by a number of environmental organizations into thinking that these food aid shipments were so-called toxic because they had GM maize in them. And, you know, that seems to me to be an example where we should be furious about the fact that there is poverty and malnutrition and malaria still in the world. We shouldn't be furious about the fact that global warming may increase the amount of malaria by a tiny percentage, about 3% is the estimate. Do you see what I mean? So it's almost that we're not alarmed enough about the things we can do something about. We're too alarmed of the new things that might be the solutions to those.
So is there anything that you feel people have accurate beliefs on but are insufficiently alarmed to the point where if they had more false beliefs, you'd think it would lead to better policy? Does that concern you?
That's a very good question. I can't think of an immediate answer. I mean, you know, Hitler and subprime mortgages were both things that people were generally not alarmed enough about. You know, there's plenty of things that come into that category, but not together. I mean, I'm not saying that Hitler was responsible for subprime mortgages, but you know. Kevin.
So, in a way, this is a two-parter, but it's the difference between exchange and getting relative prices right. So you put a lot of emphasis on exchange. You think relative prices just, you know, work themselves out, at least over the long run in the periods that you're describing. That's one question. The other question I have is also a relative price question, but slightly different, which is, where is our increased prosperity going, in a sense? Are we largely driven by biological needs and urges to satisfy what are incremental improvements? Is that where a large part of GDP is going? So the example I have is Bannister broke the 4-minute mile on 30 miles a week. And now modern athletes are trying to get down to, you know, 347 or something on 120 miles of training, et cetera. So the amount of resources going into incremental improvements on some dimension, you know, are we in that phase of our economic existence?
to answer that last point first, I mean, I think what you're, to some extent, you're talking about diminishing returns versus increasing returns, and clearly there are diminishing returns in shaving seconds off speed records in running, and there are diminishing returns in transport, I would say, these days. In other words, compared with the 19th century, when you could be born incapable of going more than the speed of a galloping horse and end up going to Australia in a month on a steam engine and on a steamship and traveling at 80 miles an hour on a steam engine. Incredible changes in your lifetime in the amount of speed you could achieve. You and I have not actually experienced that. I've never gone as fast as Chuck Yeager goes, I don't think, for example, went 50 years ago. Do you see what I mean? So there are diminishing returns in transport at the moment, but increasing returns in communication, I would guess. At some point that'll stop, and there'll be another thing that there are increasing returns in. So I don't think all technologies advance at the same time, but I do think that there will be another bus along, as it were, that there will be another group of technologies that will be showing rapid advances in our children's lifetime and our grandchildren's lifetime. I don't know which ones they'll be. Maybe biotech's next, or something like that. But just before you mentioned Bannister, you said something else.
Well, the first question was just relative prices versus exchange. Which
Yeah.
is more important?
I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean by that. I think I'm very influenced by Vernon Smith at a meeting where you were at, talking about the difference between asset markets in which people are interested in the increase in value of something versus goods and services markets.
So, for example, we draw a simple diagram often in Econ 101 where you draw a supply and demand curve, and then you point out that if you allow people to trade at all different prices, you could trade out extra marginal goods that have no value to people just by allowing for price variability to create a lot of very small value trades to occur. But the uniform price principle tends to drive you toward maximizing surplus from trading.
Mm-hmm.
And it illustrates the relative price principle in general, that you want to get the right trades to occur, not just any trade to occur.
Yeah.
But I guess the question is that really that important relative to just the power of trading itself?
Well, I think to the extent that me buying my electric light from someone else is cheaper for me than me making it for myself, I'm better off. Now, how one achieves that, etc., there are all sorts of different issues, but every time someone invents something that enables someone else to consume other people's work, as it were, to the benefit of both, then they're adding to human prosperity. Now, I mean, in the end, I think it comes down to, your price issue is all about institutions, how you sort of design markets so they produce the best results in this case. And I'm sure there's a huge amount of detail there. Yeah, I did want to just say one thing about where is all this leading, which was your middle question, as it were. And I think that the idea that at some point we'll say that's enough, we're rich enough, which after all is what J.K. Galbraith told us to say in the 1950s. It's disgusting how rich we are, we should stop, basically, was his argument in the Age of Affluence, or whatever the book was. I don't think that'll ever happen. Why not? Because what's happening here is ambition. You're always wanting to strive to, and that's a deep, deep, deep animal instinct that goes back to competition between individuals long before there was anything to do with exchange. Or as a friend of mine, Terence Keeley, once put it, back in the Stone Age, if you had 100 cattle and somebody else had 101, he got the girl and you didn't. So that's why having 101 cattle might seem trivial, but it made the difference. Well, where's the microphone that kind of come to you?
Given that you're arguing that prosperity is sort of dependent on sex between ideas, what role do you think intellectual property plays? Especially since for the past 120, for the vast majority of the past 120,000 years, we didn't have intellectual property.
Well, that's a good clue, and I've come out of this. I've come out of writing this book much more skeptical about intellectual property than I went into it, I have to say. I mean, I used to take the view that, just as real property is important because it enables people to invest, etc. So the same is true of intellectual property, and to a degree, I'm not completely off that argument, but it seems to me that this business of that the patent system and the copyright system seem to me to be encouraging the belief that inventions are much more big jumps than they are, rather than small increments, and are often getting in the way. Particularly, the patent trolls and things like that seem to me to be to be parasites on the system rather than encouragements to invention. And the thing about intellectual property, unlike real property, is that you can only make money out of it if you share it. And the patent system is, of course, designed to make you share it. But I'm not sure it's quite working as well as it could, would be my argument. And if you look at the software world, patents are pretty irrelevant. It's innovation that counts. It's being one step ahead of your competitors rather than having the ownership of an idea that really counts. I was staggered when I quoted as an epigraph at the top of a chapter in the book just a very brief bit of the lyrics of the song "What a Wonderful World." Oh, it took weeks to get permission. I had to send checks and signed affidavits to everyone, to the executors of some bloke who wrote that song in 1920 or something. Didn't seem to me to be a very good idea, that. To write the checks, definitely not. There's a question down here.
You mentioned about language having certain genes that it would be selected for by language. So I'm wondering about both anything about genetics that might be selected for by trade and exchange. And then furthermore, the effect of trade and exchange on the process of genetic selection. If I'm now able to innovate my way out of something that would have killed me before I could breed before, what should we anticipate?
Yeah. Well, on that last point, I mean, it's clear that all sorts of things we do that enable us to stay alive, which would otherwise have killed us, like short sight, for example. I wouldn't have seen the woolly rhinoceros coming in the old days. Means that we are, as a species, accumulating more genetic diversity through mutations than we probably would have done with more vigorous and vicious selection, as it were. And that's what the eugenics movement was worried about. And in the sort of very, very long term, it is an issue, but it's not something that I think we need to panic about for a few thousand years. But the earlier point about how you spotted that the way I phrased it was that language selected for FOXP2 mutations. That isn't the way most people think about it. Most people think that, suddenly there was a FOXP2 mutation and we woke up saying to be or not to be. And I don't think it was that way around, and I think what we've been, a lot of the genetic change in human beings for the last few 100,000 million years is gene culture coevolution, which is a very interesting and difficult concept, and it's a very important one, I think, and that's the best example is dairy farming. Western Europeans and some Africans have lactose tolerance. That is to say, they can digest lactose all their lives. They don't switch it off after weaning like every other animal does. A lot of other people don't have lactose tolerance. They do switch it off after weaning. The difference is that, and you can look at the African mutation that allows this and the European mutation. They're different mutations in the same gene. They were selected for by dairy farming, not the other way around. In other words, people started keeping milking animals as a source of food, which is a very clever way of getting protein and lipids into your diet. And the fact, and it was good for everybody, but the ones who could digest the lactose as adults, it was even better for them. And so there's strong selective pressure then for the gene to spread, and people who didn't take up dairying, whose ancestors didn't take up dairying, are therefore lactose intolerant today. So it's the culture that comes first and the genetic response that comes second in those cases. And I'm pretty sure it would have been the same in language. And as you're right, it must have been the same in exchange. And if you just think about one of the big issues we must have faced was how to deal with strangers, because you know, a chimpanzee never meets a chimp from another troop without trying to kill it, basically. You know, and that's just what you do if you meet members of the other troops, unless it's a female moving between troops. So I'm really talking about males, therefore. So how on earth did we go from that, which we probably were pretty well homicidal towards members of other groups, to being able to exchange with them? And you know, there may well have been genetic changes that enabled us to, you know, let's say smiling, for example. You know, if you approach someone with a smile, chances are he's not trying to kill you. And so maybe you know, a genetic program to smile as an offer of trust was selected for once we had begun exchanging. I don't know, it's much too much of a just so story that to be scientific, but it's the sort of thing that I think one should start to look out for.
So, Matt Ridley, this is not the fly fishing seminar?
Tom Hazlett, nice to see you.
No fly fishing, huh?
I've still got a hole in my head where you pulled a hook out once.
That's a great fly fisherman. So this idea that markets account for the sort of progress, particularly the progress we're seeing now in terms of innovation, is really against conventional wisdom, as you may know. And in fact, the conventional wisdom on technological progress is that it's just exogenous. Mm-hmm. Okay, that there's Moore's law, which comes from science. It's not even a social phenomenon. It's not economics. It's science. The internet, you know, was a government project. It was architected in a certain way that has established this innovation ecosystem. And here you say it's all about markets. Mm. And trade, and all these things we're seeing now are just manifestations of all these sorts of beneficial transactions that we've seen for I can't say millennia, millions. What's the millions for millennia?
Yeah, I don't know. But
so have you run into haven't read the book? Maybe you deal with that in the book, or have you run into criticism from the technocrats who
not yet.
who
I will.
represent conventional wisdom at this point.
Yeah. No, you're right, and I will. And for me, this has been an eye opener. I mean, you know, people like Terence Keeley and to some degree Paul Romer, although you know there's differences there. You know, I think have made extraordinary strides in persuading people like me that scientific innovations. Are more likely the daughters than the mothers of technological changes. That actually, you know, it's the technological changes often that comes first. Not only that, but that they are not these great sort of sudden breakthroughs that cause technologies to follow in their wake, but that what happens is you get incremental technological improvements as a result of tinkering people in markets trying to improve their products. And that's the vast bulk of innovation, and that it then triggers science to try and catch up. A lot of times science is you know, if you look at superconductivity recently, for example, theories of superconductivity have simply been struggling to explain what practical people in labs have been achieving, rather than the other way around. And I think there is a revolution does need to happen here, because still, you know, the universities are still funded on the sort of Baconian principle that if you feed basic science with money, you will get technology at the other end of the pipe. And I don't think that happens nearly as often as we think it does. You know, the search engine, was that a result of some bunch of people in a lab sitting around thinking we must invent a search engine? No, but it has had enormous impact on science, for example. So I do see technological change as endogenous. I do have a discussion of this in the book, and you're right, it's going to be an uphill struggle to change people's minds about this.
Yeah, well, I would suggest that even something like Moore's law, which is so basic to the way people think of you know, this idea that computing power doubles in constant cost terms every 18 months, And in fact, I just saw a PBS show the other day about we're running to the limits. We can't push Moore's law anymore, and so forth. And it's sort of a crisis in the making there. But people don't see that it's exactly, this is all endogenous to the markets. That is to say, Intel and other firms are organized on what they consider to be an optimal path. And the optimal path economically, given all the complementary uses for their computing power, takes them on this route that does essentially double computing power.
Absolutely.
Approximately every 18 months. And we've been on that path for 40 years now.
Yeah.
And it seems to be some kind of an equilibrium in the marketplace. Certainly it'll be disrupted at some point. But people see the science as dictating the market, when in fact it's just completely the reverse of that.
Yeah, and Moore's law is almost a corporate strategy rather than
It is a corporate strategy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, Kevin Kelly's got a new book, which I've just seen, which is not out yet, called What Technology Wants, which I think is very helpful in this respect. And he discusses Moore's law and variants of it in great deal of detail. And although he doesn't quite get the point I think you're making, he makes it very well, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think there's, and Brian Arthur's stuff on how technology evolves, the nature of technology, his book, which is essentially all about how technology is cumulative, that you can't invent X till you've invented Y, but once you've invented Y, X is almost inevitable, which is why you get simultaneous invention of things by 3 different groups and then compete. That's a much more endogenous story. So I think the revolution is happening in the right places, perhaps without people realizing it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you give an example of the search engine, and the Google story is just the opposite. They tried to architect something, and then they had all these notions about how it would happen, and then the market just led them right down to where they said initially they never wanted to be, and now they're fantastically rewarded by the market for that. But anyways,
that's a good story.
All that evolution of the marketplace is forced by these capitalist forces.
Yeah. Sorry, there's some hands up here. Women in the third row.
Thank you. This may be a related question to Tom's question. When I looked at your chart that was showing the improvements in terms of environmental quality improvements over the past several years, I think your chart started at 1980. It would be more interesting maybe for you in terms of dealing with critics, which you'll have to deal with, to extend that chart further into the past, like Inder Goswami does.
Yes.
Because you could imagine people looking at that chart and saying the reason it's better is because there's been this incredible
regulation.
growth in regulation. So it's the regulation that explains it, not the trade. So maybe in future presentations, if you have a chart that does something like the maternal health, where you put in what was the trend line going back further, that would deflect some of those criticisms.
It's a very good point, actually, and I think I've seen the I think I've seen the there's a graph. I think there's a tuberculosis graph that has a public health measure on as an arrow, and there's absolutely no change in the slope before and after. I can't remember what the public health measure was, or maybe it's the invention of antibiotics, or something. But no, thank you for that point, and I'll take that on board. Reasonably behind you.
One of the things that might affect the trend for technology, I think, are 2 things that are happening. I'd just like you to comment on. One is this notion of a world government seems to be getting some acceptance. And if you couple that with this growing acceptance of a precautionary principle that looks at something like genetically modified foods, nanotechnology, and says basically you can't produce this unless you can prove it's safe, I think that might have a tendency to sort of flatten those curves out somewhat.
Absolutely, and actually I end the book on a surprisingly pessimistic note. It's not actually pessimistic, but there is a hint of concern at the end of my book that in this globalized world we could turn our backs on technology using the precautionary principle, as you say, as a world as opposed to as a country, in a way that we couldn't imagine doing before. The Ming emperors shut down their economy pretty effectively, but they could only shut down a third of humanity. They couldn't shut down the whole thing. Now, Kyoto was a damn good stab. I mean, not Kyoto, Copenhagen was a damn good stab at putting a massive millstone around the neck of the world economy as a whole. And I think one has to be careful that in globalizing everything, we've increased the innovation rate, but we've also increased the opportunity for a plunderer, sometimes with the best of intentions, to shut the process down.
Last question.
One of you three, I don't know who got your hand up first.
Not a technology question. I want to get to the optimists in the title, and actually it's the doomsdayers and pessimists that you talk about with the middle quote. Are these folks? I mean, I think their ideas resonate with us, even those of us who disagree. There's a part of us that want to hear what the worst case scenario is, so we can prepare for that. Why has that been selected for? Has it been selected for? If it has been selected for, how do we escape that, no matter how great this book is?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Very good. Well, Brink Lindsay was quoting Woody Allen yesterday. I can't quite remember how it went, but he said there are two paths, two ways for humanity to go. One leads to doom and despair, and the other to total extinction. But we must make the right choice. I genuinely don't know the answer. I can't quite think why we're so drawn to pessimism, why it feels so much wiser. I mean, conceivably, back in the Stone Age, somebody says, I think there's a lion behind that bush. You say, oh no, probably not. Maybe that was a mistake. I don't know. Sorry, that's not a very serious answer, but it bodes ill for the sales of my book. You're right. I don't know. What's your view?
The lion.
The lion. We'll go with the lion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.